Everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to WHIMS, and today I'm going to finally give you my review for my double feature review for 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later. So the way I do these reviews is I always try to give an equal amount of time to each film. Because I'm doing two films effectively in one go, it's very hard to kind of weave a sort of narrative through the review to a certain degree, but I will try my best to give equal amounts of time to every single film. Because there's so much that I want to talk about in just the first film alone, it's going to be very difficult to manage, but we'll see how this goes. So my first review is going to be on 28 Days Later, and this came out in 2002, and this sort of came out during the time when there was a bit of a lull in zombification films, zombie apocalypse films. The craze of the Lucio Fulci era in the 1980s and the 1970s was sort of very quickly died away. There were a couple of resurgent films every once in a while, but for the most part, zombie films were effectively dead throughout the 90s. There was no zombie films of note that were happening around the time of the 1990s. And then when 28 Days Later came out, a revival of sorts happened, even though technically I still hold on to this belief that 28 Days Later isn't a zombie film, it's an apocalyptic film, and it's an infection film. Because this entire film, so for a bit of context, Danny Boyle was the director of this film, and he directed films before his earlier career, before his career really took off. He directed films like Shallow Grave and Trainspotting. But it was when he was adapting, and he wrote a lot of these films with his co-writer, John Hodges, who also worked with him on films like A Life Less Ordinary with Ewan McGregor and Cameron Diaz. But he things started to change when he went to adapt the Alex Garland novel, The Beach, into the film with the same name, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tilda Swinton. Because during that time, Alex Garland, the writer of the novel, was involved in the production to a certain extent. He still was working with John Hodges, who wrote Trainspotting, Shallow Grave and A Life Less Ordinary with him. But something changed. While they were adapting the novel of The Beach, Danny Boyle and Alex Garland were sort of thinking to themselves, let's keep in touch. They obviously enjoyed working together. So during the time between The Beach and 28 Days Later, they were sort of tossing around ideas about what they could do for a possible infection film. And they came up with the idea for 28 Days Later. And this came out in 2002. And this film stars before he retook off, Cillian Murphy, and he has his wonderful, I suppose you could say, northern accent, or Birmingham accent, I should say. Pardon me, I do beg your pardon. But yeah, he has his Birmingham accent in this. This was one of his first ever big roles. And also Naomi King also stars in this as well, and she's had quite the career since making this film. She was in the Pirates of the Caribbean film series. She was also Miss Moneypenny in the Daniel Craig James Bond films. So she's had quite the career, and I do like the fact that she's still continuing to work, because I feel like this is one of her best films in regards to her performances. But I feel like she's had quite the career after this. But all the actors in this have gone on to have really good careers after this film. But this was the first time we were seeing a lot of them. So the film 28 Days Later takes place during a time in England's, during the early 2000s, where we open effectively on a lab where an animal, an ape, is being subjected. It's been tied down, and it has sort of like this mind-reading device on its head, and it's trying to essentially, it's being shown on television monitors, all these different news, real footage articles about violence and conflict in certain areas, certain places, certain countries, and this is all done to effectively stimulate anger in the subject. So while this entire practice is taking place, a bunch of animal rights activists burst into the facility, and they try to release the monkeys, effectively release the chimpanzees, try to release the apes. But a doctor comes into the facility, sees what they're doing and tries to alert the authorities, but he ends up getting, disconnected, and they're saying to him, like, you're not going to do anything, we're going to, stop this little sick game that you're playing, and we're going to take your monkey friends with us, and we're going to try to, save these monkeys and try to help everybody, and, stop you horrible science people from testing products on animals or whatever. And he goes, no, you can't do that, you can't, you can't do that, there's an infection, it's in their blood, it's in their saliva, one bite and it's effectively dangerous, be very careful. And he goes, no, you can't touch them, you can't go near them, they're infected. And they go, infected with what? And he just goes, infected with rage. And I thought that was such a great line. And even if I didn't know the entire history of Alex Garland before seeing this film, I could definitely tell just from that one line alone that he probably had a background as a novelist, because that phrase is just very poetic, the idea of saying infected with rage. That line alone is worth the price of admission alone for this film. And chaos ensues. One of the animal rights activists opens a cage, one of the monkeys gets out, jumps on her, bites her, and then immediately she becomes infected, she vomits blood, which is obviously a sign that you're infected, but also she ends up infecting everybody else. And then the film briefly cuts, and it's revealed that 28 days later, the entirety of London has just been absolutely wiped out by this particular infection, this particular rage infection. And what I want to draw attention to before we move on with the plot, there's a wonderful sequence where when you see the animal tied up, the monkey or the ape tied up, and it's sort of tied up, and it has a very similar pose where its arms are sort of like outstretched, and it reminded me of the way Jim looks, Cillian Murphy's character, when we first open on him in the hospital. It kind of almost feels like he's trying to draw attention to something there, like Danny Moore's trying to draw attention to something there, or Alex Garland, both of them want to draw attention to something in that sense, of maybe we're not so different from the animals, we're not so different from the apes, or something like that, or we're not so different in the sense that we do give way to our more primal instincts, which is really interesting considering what happens later on in the film, but we'll get to that. And when Cillian Murphy wakes up, he essentially goes through London. It's completely isolated. Like there's no people around. All the cars are abandoned, and you don't see. And this is very refreshing. You don't see a single dead body. You don't see blood spatter or shattered glass. You don't see fire. You don't see a person running away from an infected, screaming the top of their lungs out like Dawn of the Dead, the 2004 version. Yeah, I'm going to get to that film at some point someday because I have thoughts. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Dawn of the Dead, the 2004 film. Just a slight spoiler. But yes, I want to do a review of that at some point to show you guys what sort of gripes I have with that film and how I feel like that film was basically made out of spite because of the success of this film. But yes, I personally think that this opening is brilliant because it's much more subtle, it's much more minimalist, I suppose you could say, in how it likes to present the horror, because usually with a lot of horror films you usually have to show a lot of carnage. If you don't even show dead bodies, you have to show some degree that something bad has happened, like shattered glass, fires happening everywhere. But this film decides to do something even more creepier because there's so much silence, there's so much isolation, you don't know what to think. So you're kind of thinking, what happened? But we kind of know what happened. We know that this infection is so deadly that it wiped out an entire world. But there's something really kind of wonderful about, you kind of know what's happened, but you're kind of almost dreading it, because Cillian Murphy's character, Jim, he doesn't know what happened. So, he kind of just goes around London and he sees all these different, missing persons posters and, personal messages from people that's outside on this board. He sees a newspaper that says immediate evacuation from London. And he goes into a church and he sees it's mostly empty. And he sees a couple of people asleep, or what he thinks is, he just sees like this massive dead bodies. And he calls out hello, and there's just these two people who get up, and they're clearly infected, but they just stare at him. That moment is so creepy, that when they just stand up and they're just looking at him, and they don't do anything. They don't run up to go and chase him. They just basically look at him. And then when Jim is wandering through the church, he sees the father emerge from one of the doors, and he's essentially saying, "You all right, Father? What's happened here? What's going on?" And the father's like coughing and like acting like giving these sort of animalistic twitching noises, and the priest immediately goes up to him, but then he starts to growl, and Jim just sort of whacks him with the bag, and he goes, "Oh shit, I shouldn't have done that." and I like that moment because it shows what sort of a character he is. He's clearly a character who has a conscience, because most people who would be in that situation wouldn't care that they'd just struck a priest, even if they were a zombie or not, or an infected in this case or not. They would just sort of whack them and then just run away. But the fact that he takes a moment to say, "Oh shit, I shouldn't have done that," that tells you everything you need to know about his character, that he is someone who is getting used to the idea of there being an apocalypse. So when he leaves, he runs into these two survivors named Selena and Mark, and they're held up in this off-license place, and they're just sort of chatting about the infection, and you don't really know all that much about what's going on. You just know that Jim wants to get back to his family, and you don't even know that much about the various different families that each of the survivors that we've currently met are going through. You just essentially hear about the infection. You hear that it's gone to America. There's reports of the rage infection happening in America and all these other places, but you don't really get the full story about what each and every single individual person has gone through. So when it's agreed that Jim wants to go visit his parents, he goes into the house and he finds that they are dead and they have taken an overdose pills and they've killed each other in order to be, away from this horror. But then they leave a note to Jim saying that we'll be in heaven with you soon, and whatever you do, don't wake up. And it's that, so many details like that really do hit home how dark and how really sad this film is. And not many films of this nature, the apocalypse or the post-apocalyptic type story, would ever focus on these details. The idea that Jim has effectively lost his parents and he's now had to go it alone, which kind of ties into what I want to say about 28 Years Later when I eventually get to that. But for the sake of quickness, during a nighttime wander around, Jim encounters a couple of infected. Selena kills a couple of them, and during the scuffle, Mark gets infected and Selena has to kill him. And she goes, "I had to kill Mark. You have, when a person gets infected, if it gets in your eye, your ear, or your mouth, any of their blood or saliva gets in your ears, eyes, or mouth, you have about 5 to 10 seconds to kill them." And she even says to him, "If it happens to you, I'll do it in a heartbeat." And remember that line, because that's very important later on, because it turns out that Selena doesn't have a very positive view on survival. In fact, she believes that if the chances were for her, she'd pretty much want to just survive on her own and have no one to really care about. And to a certain degree, this could be considered as a bad thing, but that kind of makes me wonder, what did happen to her family? What did happen to her family that made her so cold and so unwilling to be with anyone, or kind of stay or remain with anyone, or form any strong relationships with any groups of people? It's probably because she had such a strong family unit that just seeing the rage infection take out her entire family and have to contemplate killing her own brothers or sisters or even her mother and father is something that really traumatised her to a degree that she doesn't want to establish any of those connections ever again, just in case she gets her heart broken. So she's keeping a very guarded persona just so she can survive and sort of feel like an everyman for themselves kind of thing. And it's really kind of sad, but it shows there's a point where it's almost like a character thing, like a character development element to a character, because I feel like, to me, Selena does go through quite the rapid change throughout the course of this story. She goes from someone who doesn't care about getting any companions to someone who gradually, becomes accustomed to the idea of having a family, and this all happens with the introduction of a pair of Christmas lights up on a block of flats. So they go to that particular location and they encounter, after they run into the infected again during a particular sequence, they find Frank and his daughter Hannah, who are the only survivors in this block of flats, And while they're there, they find a radio signal saying that the answer to infection is here in Manchester. So they go into a taxi, they try to leave London, but while they're in the middle of a tunnel, they get a flat tyre, and then of course this leads into a very suspenseful sequence where they're trying to change said tyre, but then all of a sudden a flock of rats starts to very slowly creep, or very quickly creep up, almost like a flood of leaking water, all over the taxi, all over everyone involved, and it's really horrific. But they're running away from the direction of the infected, where the infected comes, so it gives you that sense that these vermin are even afraid of these creatures. It's really quite remarkable in how it's done, and I love the suspense that they're really rushing to change the tyre, but then they're just round the corner, they're just running up, and then it all culminates when they get the tyre fitted and they're about to drive away. There's that really wonderful shot where one of the infected goes up against the glass, and there's like this horrible red glow underneath the infected from reflected in his eyes. There's such a great image, and you hear like that muffled scream to kind of add the cherry on top of the cake to that moment, and it's really just, it's beautiful horror storytelling, because it's a great way of saying basically you were just nearly dead within the skin of your teeth, and now they're moving along. And there's a lot of other great sequences in this film. There's a sequence where they're in the supermarket and they're getting food. There's that wonderful moment where Frank gets all these different beverages of champagne or wine. He goes, get this particular beverage, it's much better. And there's even that wonderful moment where he puts his MasterCard card on one of the cash registers. They're not going to use it anymore, so they just think, get the food we're going to get, and let's just go. Let's get out of London. And there's this really beautiful moment where Jim is starting to really get close to this family unit. In fact, Zelina, Hannah, and Jim and Frank kind of feel like their own little found family unit, because with Jim and Hannah, they kind of feel like there's almost like this big brother energy to Jim, the way he acts, the way he behaves around Hannah. And there's even that moment at the end, spoiler alert, when the big confrontation's just happened, and there's that moment where he just goes, are you stoned? It's like he has sort of like this very big brother type tone to his voice when he's talking to Hannah. I just love those little moments like that. And to a certain degree, Frank is sort of like Jim's surrogate father, because he does sort of have these moments where they are, you know, talking and doing stuff together, and even when they're like looking through the beverages in the supermarket and they figure out which ones to do, they are establishing a bit of a rapport. So when Zelina sees this, she has this big discussion about survival, and about, you know, the fact that when this is all over, you won't be able to read a book that hasn't already been written, or see a film that hasn't already been made or been shot. And she goes, you know, Jim, when I said staying alive is as good as it gets, I'll be happy to admit that I was wrong on that. And it's really a wonderful moment, because it shows that Zelina herself, even though she is someone who's gone through a lot of hardship, she's willing to see that maybe she had a couple of issues of her own in regards to trust and bonding with people as well. But it's justifiably so. No one's a complete monster, or no one's a complete douchebag in this. It feels like they all have their reasons to behave the way that they do, and it's really heartbreaking when it's revealed. When they get to Manchester, there's this really horrifying sequence where Frank gets a bit of the infected's blood in his eye from a crow, of all things. And there's that really sad moment. It was in one of those videos that I made that made me cry, where it's like, it's horrible, because Brandon Gleeson, who's an incredible actor, does a very good job of showing how afraid he is once he's been infected, but at the same time he also shows that he sees his daughter. He just says, Hannah, I'm sorry I shouted at you. And I'm even getting teary-eyed just thinking about it. He says, Hannah, I'm sorry I shouted at you. And he goes, Dad, it's okay. And he goes, Hannah, I love you very much. And it's like, it's so heartbreaking. And it's one of those moments where I just think, oh no, Frank. And then he starts to, she goes up to him wanting to hug him and talk to him, but then he's like going, get away from me. And he's like getting very angry and very aggressive. And what's really frightening and also very sad is the fact that he knows he's changing. He knows he's being turned into this monster, and it's just so beautifully done. And I feel like, and honestly, Naomi King in this scene is amazing, because not only is she's screaming at Jim to kill him, like kill him, Frank is infected, kill him, Jim is infected, and he wants him to do it. And of course, even Jim, most people would have just said, okay, I'm going to kill this person, but the fact that he hesitates tells you how much they've bonded as a family at this point. And it really is genuinely heartbreaking to see. So when she's like screaming, Jim, kill him, he's infected, she's not just simply screaming for her own survival, but she's also screaming, and there's a sadness in her voice as well. Like, she knows that they've bonded with these two people, and the fact that she's now having to witness the death of someone's father, it's almost like it triggered something in her. And I think I like that moment, and the fact that she cries after the military save them, quote unquote, save them, because I have theories that they might have staged all that. I think they might have staged Frank getting infected. I don't know how that works, but I think it seems too much of a convenience that they just happened to show up on the nick of time to basically just save Jim and the two women. It's just very weird, because it just feels like if they clearly cared about both of them, like both Frank, Jim, and Selena and Hannah, they would have just stepped in beforehand and just come out. But the fact that they kind of just came out and shot Frank, it just kind of tells me, were they genuinely sad that he had died, or were they just thinking to themselves, oh, we've now killed this one guy, let's now get the two people that we want, and let's bring Jim along for kicks. It's really kind of dark. It makes you look at certain scenes a different way once you know what their true intentions are, just saying. But yes, it's one of those things that really was heartbreaking, and the fact that Selena breaks down during that moment and she literally just says, Jim, Hannah's just lost her dad, and it's just really heartbreaking, because again, it's so small, but the fact that made her turn a little bit and realise how important family is and being a part of a group is, it tells you how much of a strong character she is, and the fact that she's able to just go through so much. And honestly, the rest of this film is just amazing, from the climax to the introduction of Christopher Eccleston's character, who's this captain. He's brilliant, just on the choices that Christopher Eccleston made for this character, because for one thing, he does something which I kind of find quite interesting. He decides to portray this captain with a posh accent. That tells you a lot about what he's trying to do with this character, because when we think of posh accents, we think of someone who is sophisticated, kind of like me, where there's kind of a sense of, there's a sophistication to it, but then there's also an element of, oh, there's worldliness, there's trust, there's level-headedness as well. And when you kind of give those sort of characteristics to Christopher Eccleston's character, who, as it turns out, spoiler alert, he wanted to create the broadcast, the signal, so that he could bring a group of people with women, so that him and his soldiers could repopulate the earth in a particular period of time when the infected have starved to death. That's horrifying. The fact that he can literally create this sort of persona so he can bring people in and, you know, seduce them into this false sense of security, only to use them to procreate, or use the women in their company as sort of like a means to procreate. That's horrifying. And the fact that they both imprison Jim, but then he escapes, and they try to essentially assault both Selena and Hannah, who is 16, by the way, and they're planning on assaulting a 16-year-old. That's really dark. And it's so dark, in fact, that even Selena gives her pills, and she says, "What are these?" And Selena goes, "I'm going to make you not care." That's just so horrifying. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's one of those things where you think to yourself, if I were to be in this environment, would I want to be in this environment, or would I want to take my chances with the infected? I know the infected are still horrible to deal with, but the fact that you're kind of trapped in this situation where you're forced into a situation that you don't want to be in, it's horrifying. So this film does a very good job of doing that, but also the atmosphere in this climax, the use of John Murphy's In a Heartbeat was brilliant. I feel like the use of this track is so brilliant in edging up the intensity, and I love the use. There's something about seeing Hannah wandering through the corridors of this manor house or this mansion in semi-darkness whilst the song In a Heartbeat's playing, but then she's also got like this pink sort of reddish dress on, and she's sort of wandering through the house in semi-darkness. That accompanied with this track along with the thunder and the lightning, it was a brilliant pairing, and it really edges up the intensity. And honestly, despite the fact that she's effectively stoned, Hannah does a lot of the smartest things in the entire film. But she literally, when the infected are going into the room, she hides behind the mirror, so she doesn't. So all she has to do is just keep still for when that's happening, and it's so well done. And the climax is brutal, bloody, but it's very brilliant, and it all kind of culminates in a scene where Jim rushes through the window, beats the living shit out of this soldier, bashes his head against the wall, throws him on the ground, and then he gouges out his eyes. And Zelina's face when she's watching this, like, this is someone who is horrified. Like, this person, even if he wasn't infected, this still would be a horrifying sight. And the fact that she grabs the machete and she's ready to strike him, and then the music just stops after that, and then he just sort of looks at her, their hearts are racing, and he just goes, that was longer than a heartbeat. That to me was like perfection, and I really did love the use of all those elements throughout the course of this climax. And the fact that they got the captain, played by Christopher Eccleston, in the back of this taxi that Hannah's in, but then she drives the taxi so that it reverses back into the manor house where one of the infected is, and the infected just drags him through the window, and then Jim and Selena get in, and then they just drive, and then there's that wonderful freeze frame where just before they're crashing through the gates they lurch forward, and then there's that cut of Selena trying to revive Jim, and she's like, come on, breathe, live. And then there's that moment where you see the upside down lettering in the fields spelling out hell, and then you could have just cut to him waking up in the morning in a much more safer bed environment, kind of very similar to the opening. And then we have the reveal that, they're spelling out the words hello for an oncoming aircraft to fly by, or an oncoming helicopter to fly by. It's a brilliant ending to a really brilliantly atmospheric horror film, and everything's just really great about this. I love the scene where, one of the scenes that I didn't mention when I was talking about it was the scene where when Frank and Hannah and Zelina are out in this field, Jim has a dream where he effectively wakes up and he's on his own. That's one of my worst nightmares. Just waking up and just having no one there is a horrifying scenario for me. Even if you weren't dealing with infected, that's a horrifying scenario of just the inherent loneliness of the whole thing that really plays on your mind. And it's peppered throughout this film, the idea of isolation and the idea that you can't connect with someone as easily as you could do during this sort of scenario really writes itself home. And that's kind of something that I'm going to pick on Dawn of the Dead for, because it's so easy for these characters to make friends in Dawn of the Dead. I felt like there was something lacking there, and they basically turned, I'm just going to have a little mini review, they turned one of the most sad and one of the most melancholic elements of the original George Romero film, and they turned it into a punchline to a joke. And I thought, I don't really find any of this scary. And I just think that's the difference between Dawn of the Dead and 28 Days Later. It plays on themes that are genuinely frightening. Even if you were to remove them from the horror genre, there's something about them that's quite terrifying. Whereas with Dawn of the Dead, it's like, we have a quirky scene where one of the characters is shooting zombies, and they're holding up plaques saying, like, how many have you got so far? 20 or 10? It's like, immediately the actual isolation and the horror and the actual seriousness of the situation is completely drained. And I'm sorry to say this, I love James Gunn, but this is one of his worst screenplays. Like, honestly, if you have something like this, where it's like, it's so, when you have 28 Days Later and it's so good, but then you have Dawn of the Dead and it just sucks, it really speaks volumes. So, that's my thoughts on Dawn of the Dead. I don't really like it that much. The opening's okay, the build-up's decent, but I think the issue with the reveal of the apocalypse, it's so over the top that I kind of found myself going, James Gunn, you're a much more smarter writer than this. Come on, like, you know how to write a very intelligent build-up. Why couldn't you have exercised some restraint whilst you were making this? Like, and I'm not going to blame it all on James Gunn, I'm going to blame it on Zack Snyder as well, but Zack Snyder knows subtlety too. Like, he knows how to really let stuff play and when to let stuff just sort of very slowly simmer and things like that. So they're both talented filmmakers, but they just need to know how to have restraint. It's just really ridiculous. So 28 Days Later is fabulous. 28 Weeks Later, on the other hand, is still good, but it's kind of still good in the same way that it's kind of like, imagine Creepshow, the 1982 film starring, written by Stephen King and directed by George Romero. That's a great film, but then when you watch Creepshow 2, it's still good, but a slight step down. That's kind of how I feel about 28 Weeks Later, because this film does begin in a very compelling way. It starts off with a character by the name of Donald Harris and his wife, played by Robert Carlyle, who basically are held up in this little cottage in the countryside, and they're about to eat dinner with a bunch of other survivors, and they're contemplating what's happening to their children in Paris and how they're grateful that they signed off on that school trip to go to Paris before, any of the disaster hit. And they're about to eat dinner, and whilst they're about to sit down and eat, there's a discussion about who's alive and who's dead, and then there's a knock on the door and a boy shows up, and he's clearly very, distressed. He's got a lot of, blood and dirt on him, so they basically bring him in because Alice, Donald's wife, says, "Come on, Donald, he's a kid," and she does it because the mother instinct is there. She can't switch it off, and because she was talking about how she was worried about her own children, she's putting herself in the mother role in that instance, and she's like saying, what would happen if that was my child outside that door? What would I do? I'd want someone to bring that person in and look after them. So that's what she's doing. She's thinking as a mother in that moment. And Don, even though he has the best of intentions for both his wife and this new child that they've got, he also is thinking about his own children, and that plays into how the rest of the scene happens, because something happens when one of the survivors is looking out of the boarded house. The windows are boarded up, and there are these infected outside, and one of them sees one of the infected, and they reach in through the beams, and they grab her, and they bite her, and they pull themselves in, and sunlight drapes through or drips through, and the infected are inside the house. There's lots of chaos, there's lots of bloodshed, and what's very interesting during this moment is Don is contemplating escaping, but at the same time Alice is not only thinking about her own children, but she's also thinking about this child, so she's obviously going where this child goes. And there's this moment where he contemplates staying with her, but then he wants to fight the infected and keep both them and this new child safe. But then he just thinks to himself, I'm just going to... And he's not doing this in a malicious way, I don't think. I want to give Don a little bit of credit, because if you're in that situation and you've got children who aren't with you at the moment, but you know they're safe and you want them both to survive, you're thinking about the children that you do have, your own flesh and blood. And even though Alice is thinking about this child and she's in mother mode with this other child, she's not thinking about her own children, so she's thinking about, protecting this other child. But Don is thinking about the children who are still alive, and he says to himself, well, I want to make sure that the person who lives through this, I want both of us to survive, but if one of us has to survive and one of us has to survive to be back there for our children, I'm going to take that chance and I'm going to leave. He doesn't want to, but he does. And lots of people might say, oh, he's an arsehole for doing this, but I absolutely think it's not an easy situation to make. During that moment where you clearly are in danger, he's going to make a decision, and yes, it may not sit well with a lot of people, but I do think it works because, and of course, the use of In a Heartbeat, John Murphy's In a Heartbeat in this scene was beautifully implemented, because again, it's that idea where it's just that split decision between making a decision or staying put, and he decided to make a decision and leave, and it's just really powerful. But he clearly has a lot of guilt during this moment, because when his children return to London and he tells them about it, his children, I think one of them is called Andy, and the other one I think is called, I can't remember what the sister's called. I can't remember her name. Remind me in the comments when this video's done. But yeah, they're both sitting on the sofa, and this is the first instance where we actually see Don after the apocalypse, or after this situation on the farm, and he basically gives a much more watered down version of what actually happened. He basically says, we tried to get out, but I left, we were overwhelmed, and I left. And to a certain degree, he's sort of telling the truth, but he sort of leaves out the fact that he just decided to abandon his wife, and the daughter knows what's going on. She can see in his eyes that there's something else going on there, even though she is also willing to take him at his word at this point. And it's actually quite horrible, but what's really fascinating about this opening moment is when the children are returning, a military personnel played by Rose Byrne, she played the mum in the Insidious films. She was also in Bridesmaids. She played Christian Wiig's rival to Maya Rudolph, effectively. They're trying to play, bridesmaids or maids of honour, and they kind of have this little rivalry. It's that actress. She was also in the Bad Neighbours film series. I can't remember the actress's name, technically. It's called Rose Byrne. Let me know what that is in the comments. But yeah, she's a good actress, and she basically plays this military doctor who spots that in Andy's retinas there's a slight change, and he says, "Oh, I get that from my mum," and that's very important because when Andy and his sister go into the city, they spot their old house and they go inside, and during this time they see Alice, their mother. And I want to make perfectly clear, just in case I didn't make it obvious in the first part of that 28 weeks later part of the review, the American military have now taken over London, and they're now treating it like a hostile war zone, technically, or an infection area that they need to control and rebuild effectively. And this entire system could work, but it doesn't work tremendously well. So when Alice returns, they clean her up in this decontamination area, which is a horrifying scene to watch. Honestly, the scenes with the military and what the military are willing to do to stop the spread of infection is actually quite horrifying. The fact that and honestly, the actress who plays Alice does such a good job of selling how dehumanising that moment is, and how she's just surrounded by people in hazmat suits who are basically just washing her and gassing her. It's a really horrible sequence, and it just really shows how dehumanising that whole process is. And they don't treat her like she's a human being, they treat her like she's some sort of thing that's capable of infection. There's something really quite messed up about that. And I like that little recurring theme in both 28 Days and 28 Weeks Later, where you can't trust the military, even though they may have, in the case of 28 Weeks Later, they have the best of intentions. They don't want to spread infection, they want to keep it as close to the UK as possible, but at the cost of that, they're also risking people's lives. Because there is a point where the chaos rings out and they just say, abandon selective targeting, let's just kill anything in sight, and they end up nuking the entire area of London later on in the film. And I thought, this is something that's so unethical, but you kind of get the thought process behind it. Even though it is unethical, it is still horrible. And in the case of 28 Days Later, these military personnel, because they've gone rogue and they're essentially playing by their own rules, you don't trust them equally as much, because you feel like just because they've got a posh guy as their leader doesn't mean they're any kind of more ethical than the average Joe who's just looking for kicks, let's just say. So it's really quite horrifying that that's the case. So Don goes to go and see Alice, obviously guilt-ridden, and he ends up, kissing her, and that's when he becomes infected. And this was the most horrible sequence to watch, because not only does he get infected, and not only does poor Alice have to go through a lot in order to survive that horrible encounter at the farm, but she also has to deal with the fact that she's gone through the most horrible dehumanising decontamination process imaginable ever caught on film. But then you've also got this very horrifying sequence where she's watching her husband change into this rage-infected being. But he doesn't just bite her, and he doesn't just eat her. He punches her, and I thought this was really horrible. And the fact that he gouges out her eyes, very similar to what Cillian Murphy did to the soldier. I had to stop the film when this moment happened. Like, this was such a horrifying watch. Like, seeing him basically just do that to... And again, it's proving to you that he's in control. He knows that he is getting taken over. And that's why I think this is completely different to a zombie film. Because zombie films, they're already dead. And if they're bitten, they're at risk of dying before they change. Whereas when you are infected with the rage virus, you are still human deep down. And there is a little bit of... There's a few hints of the old Donald Harris when the film goes on. Like when you see that point of view character, he's attacking the soldiers and he's like biting them and tearing flesh from limbs and things like that. There is that element of recognition. Like when he sees his son Andy, there is that element of recognition. He knows that there's a little bit of his son in there, or he knows that there's a little bit of his father in there, and of course Donald knows that he's his son, but he still can't help this very primal rage. And I just found it completely 100% insane. I loved... It's devastating, but I loved the scene where they just say abandon selective targeting, just shoot anything in sight, and they just nuke the entire city, because it tells you how desperate the military have gotten. But to a certain degree, I think, even though the military are also not to be trusted in this version, I feel like they're much more trustworthy than the soldiers in 28 Days Later, because yes, they're sort of like a rogue set of soldiers, whereas in the case of these soldiers, they're under strict instructions to keep the residents of this city, this complex in London, safe. So they're following orders, but they also want to stop the spread of infection. So they're doing whatever they can, and the general, who plays the head of this sort of department of soldiers, is played by Idris Elba. And I love Idris Elba, he's gorgeous. But I don't like a character he plays on British television called John Luther. I think him and this sergeant are very similar to the sort of people that I would sort of like clash with on an ethical level, because I feel like he's a monster. I feel like because the fact that he's so willing to kill people just to stop the spread of infection, I think we need to also consider the fact that these are innocent people that you're also killing as well, who are just trying to survive just as much as we are. It's a horrifying scenario, but yeah, I loved his role in this, because it really just kind of shows how empathetic he is as well. Like, I don't like John Luther as a character, but I love Idris Elba, so I think, yes, he does a really good job of playing a much more fairer version of John Luther in my eyes. But yes, I absolutely thought it was a brilliant sequence. And I have to say, there's a lot of really great sequences after this as well. Like, I love the scene where one of the survivors gets on a helicopter and... I don't know the actor's name, but the actor who plays Hawkeye is escorting both Rose Byrne, Andy and his sister across London to try to get to a safe zone so they could get to safety. And one of his friends turns up and one of the survivors jumps on the end of the helicopter, and a bunch of infected are about to run down this hill, and he basically drives the blade of the helicopter through this infected, and it just creates like a splatter or a wave of blood-soaked grassland and body parts. It's just really horrific. Very Michael Bay-esque, but I found myself going, fuck yes. And it just kind of felt chaotic, but it felt just right. And even though it was a little bit of betrayal of what the first one was, I feel like this one does deliver on some of the more crowd-pleasing moments, and I'm going to get on to the fuck yeah moments in the other films when I get to those reviews, those 28 Years Later and 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. But yeah, Rose Byrne's character, this medical doctor, says that Andy had a particular retina difference that's very similar to his mum, and he could potentially hold the possibility for a cure to the rage virus, so they need to get him to a safe zone. So Don follows them. Hawkeye's character gets killed by a bunch of flamethrower military personnel who want to cage the infection, and the two Harris children and the medical doctor character go into the subway. They get lost, all this underground area, they get lost. Andy runs into his father, he gets bitten, and the sister pretty much kills him in a very badass way, where she just screams his name, Don, and she just shoots him in the head. And I thought that was brilliant. But I absolutely just think this climax is really good. And then it ends with them getting away in a helicopter, but not before. There's this little end point in the epilogue where it's revealed that they've gone all the way to Paris, that the infected are now in Paris, and it's probably going to spread throughout the world. And I thought, fuck you, 28 Weeks Later, I hate this ending. And it kind of tells me about my views overall. I like 28 Weeks Later, but in terms of the two, I much prefer 28 Days Later. 28 Weeks Later is still good, and it still has those great crowd-pleasing fuck yes moments, but at the same time, I still found there were a couple of things here that I didn't like. I liked, for instance, the fact that we had a character who was infected. I like the fact that Don starts off as this character who you think is going to be the lead throughout the course of the story, but when the infection happens and he becomes infected, he becomes now the antagonist. I like that idea of someone who was once the protagonist becoming the antagonist. I like that trajectory, and it does a great way of completely and utterly changing your perception of the character overall. And the fact that he does something not so heroic, but then at the same time you almost can see the justification in Robert Carlyle's performance, was brilliant. I found it to be a really great example of both his acting and just the fact that he's able to play this character with so much depth and complexity, even though the second half of his performance is him mostly not speaking. He mostly conveys a lot of his emotions through his gestures and his pauses, and the fact that he sort of gives this little look or a little turn of his head whenever he looks at someone, like his son, for instance, or his daughter. There's something about that really adds a lot of humanity and a lot of depth, and I think that plays a role into the character of Samson in the later films, the 28 Years Later films, which I'm going to get to when I get to that. But I absolutely love these films. I love 28 Days Later more than the sequel, but I do think the sequel has some good moments as well. But that's my review for 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more, please subscribe for more. I hope you have a very good day. Take care, bye for now.